I'm going to just take a few minutes now to summarize what my takeaways are from this really remarkable day. I hope you have found it equally so. Let me start with where Ambassador Bolton and Governor Pataki focused, the Obama bomb deal. That's not just a quip. The administration itself has said this is the equivalent to Obamacare. So I think that really ought to be the leitmotif as we address what is unmistakably the most dangerous agreement in our nation's history. We are legitimating, we are emboldening, we are empowering, we are funding, we are even arming what is arguably the most dangerous regime on the planet at the moment. That means that the alternative to this deal is not war, as the president and all of his apologists or supporters, partisans claim. The deal is war. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the continuation of the war we've been in since 1979 with the Iranians. We've failed to acknowledge it, we failed to respond to it, we failed to take it as seriously as we must. But make no mistake, they understand they're at war with us. They say it every day, really. The problem is that that means not only that we are handing them the greatest victory to date in this 36-year-long war, by far. I mean, Admiral Lyons talked about, bombing of embassies, taking of hostages, bombing of a warship, and the like. By the way, it's a little known fact, a federal judge has affirmed it, they were also very much involved in and arguably indispensable to the attacks of 9/11. Did you know that? But this is in a whole different class in terms of a victory for a combatant in a war like this, for all the reasons that I've just mentioned. It is one that is indisputably putting at existential risk our ally, Israel, which, by the way, the administration, as you probably saw today, has begun trotting out that it's going to be Israel's fault if Congress doesn't go along with this deal. And as one wag noted, that's what they're saying on week one of this 2-month exercise. Imagine how ugly this is going to get if, as I pray, the American people, as well as the people of Israel, and hopefully freedom-loving people around the world, rally to oppose this deal. But as we've discussed in that first important segment, this is a threat, an existential threat to America as well. The capabilities that Iran will have, make no mistake about it. John Guandolo may be right, others who've commented on this may be right, that they already have the bomb. I think you said that. Maybe it was not you, but Peter Husey, somebody. I've said it. I think they may well have the bomb already. But even the president has said that at the end of this 10-year process, they will be able to get it virtually immediately. Now, he subsequently recanted having said that, but that is what he said. And it's true. For the simple reason that everything they need to get the bomb is allowed to remain in place in Iran, and will. And I don't mean in the secret caverns of underground bunkers. I'm talking about in their declared facilities. And oh, by the way, we will, in fact, as you've heard, be actually not only helping advance that program by infusing it with more sophisticated technology, we will be obliged to protect it. despite the fact that what that nuclear capability represents is the last ingredient they need for the electromagnetic pulse threat they pose and say doctrinally they intend to wield against this country's electric grid. My revered colleague, despite his failure to follow any of my instructions, Admiral Lyons, uncharacteristically hedged a little by saying what has happened here in this surrender to the mullahs borders on treason. I will tell you in my professional judgment, ladies and gentlemen, this is treason. I was delighted to hear the governor say, as he did the other night, that he thinks this violates the oath of office. Whatever you describe it as, it is certainly an impeachable offense. And I pray that we will find people who are willing to take that course of action, if none other are available. Let me talk about a couple of other aspects of the global jihad, because that is, of course, part of it. They couldn't be more clear. Their purpose is to do exactly what you've heard from our distinguished speakers in this last segment, imposing Sharia over all of us in the Dar al-Harb. They've got their Shiite strain to it, to be sure. But as I've said, whether it's with respect to 9/11 or any number of other incidences, they're willing to collaborate with their Sunni enemies, with whom they disagree violently on certain points that frankly seem to be fairly small issues of theology. But for them, they're killing offenses. But they nonetheless will join forces to kill us at the drop of a hat. Again, we have these two component parts. We have the Islamic State. We have Hamas and Hezbollah and Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and all the rest of those cats who are engaged in the violent jihad, who are determined to achieve their vision of the Islamic State that will rule the world. And then there's that other force within this Sharia-driven jihadist enterprise, the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is the little handy guide to the Muslim Brotherhood that I gave the governor a moment ago and that I spoke of. It's called the Explanatory Memorandum on the General Strategic Goal of the Group in North America. It was introduced into evidence, as I think John said, in the Holy Land Foundation trial. Despite the fact that people are going to great lengths at the moment, notably the Council on American-Islamic Relations, something called the Bridge Initiative, which is a Muslim Brotherhood operation run out of my alma mater, Georgetown University, enabled by funding from one of the big sponsors of this kind of activity, Al-Walid bin Talal, a Saudi billionaire, and also David Shipler, a former New York Times correspondent. Whatever they say about the insignificance or irrelevance of this document, this memorandum to the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters from one of their top operatives in the United States circa 1991, 4 federal judges confirmed that it was the real deal and could be used to prosecute and convict the terrorists' sponsors, supporters, material enablers of the global jihad in the form of Hamas, doing business as the Holy Land Foundation. I commend this to you. Again, it's available for free online if we've got some copies left, but this really is kind of, I call it the Rosetta Stone My wife Marisol has been translating it into Spanish for us and has now committed to memory what this playbook is. It's really incredibly valuable because it tells you how this civilization jihad is being waged effectively against us. And as you've heard, they've made great progress. Whether it's on 700 of our campuses, which speaks to some of the issues of political correctness there, or whether it's in our courts. Got a couple of show and tells here. Our courts, the subject of this book, Sharia in American courts, the expanding incursion of Islamic law in the U.S. legal system, one of our Civilization Jihad Reader Series products. My colleague Tommy Waller just pointed out something that's relevant, directly relevant to this point that I was making about that trajectory and how, you don't go to the next phase of the violent phase until you're strong enough. This is a quote from a Dr. AlSawi, who is the Secretary General of something called AMJA, the Association of Muslim Jurists of America, one of the most important, most insidious of the Muslim Brotherhood fronts engaged in this enterprise because, as John said, these are not clerics, these are scholars, these are jurists, and therefore what they're handing down is the rule of law, according to them, their fatwas. Anyway, AlSawi responds to a question about, quote, whether the Islamic missionary effort in the West was to the point where it could take advantage of offensive jihad, to which he responded, quote, the Islamic community does not possess the strength to engage in offensive jihad at this time. With our current capabilities, we are aspiring towards defensive jihad and to improve our position with regards to jurisprudence at this stage. But there is a different discussion for each situation. Allah Almighty knows best, which, translated, means we're doing what we can do now, we're biding our time, we're building our capabilities. We've got to fully understand the breadth, the dimensions, the ambitions, and the capabilities of these enemies, whether they fall at the moment in this violent space or in the stealthy, subversive, civilization jihad, seditious space. And the question that was asked about the training camps in America, those are folks who are actually in the business of offensive jihad, and yet we're treating them as though they're not even in the defensive jihad business. And, I think the question was apt, and I was delighted that it was put pointedly to the governor. Islamburg has been around for quite some time. It is, I think, one of, if not the most important of the franchises of something called Muslims of America, or Jamaat al-Fuqra, which is the subject of an important documentary that was done by Christian Action Network, CAN, that's what I was trying to wrestle with. Anyway, so we've got to get straight the nature of the enemy and what they're seeking to do to us. We've got to understand that they are using the Al-Hijra. This is a copy of that other book I was referring to earlier, also in the Civilization Jihad Reader Series, also available for free by Ann Corcoran, Refugee Resettlement and the Hijra to America. To understand that at the very least, whether you believe that we ought to be expelling everyone who is engaged in this enterprise or not, at the very least, it just stands to reason we shouldn't bring more of them in, right? Have them build still more jihadist mosques or still more of these various front organizations. We need, in addition, to use all instruments of national power to defeat these guys. Another helpful product of Team B, we call it, or Tiger Team rather, that we put together is this one called the Secure Freedom Strategy. I think you might find this interesting simply because this takes the strategy that we know can work. because my old boss Ronald Reagan used it to defeat the last totalitarian ideology that sought to destroy America, namely Soviet communism. And we essentially just mapped what he called National Security Decision Directive 75 to the present circumstances, and guess what? It seems pretty darn relevant and would be considerably more likely to succeed than whatever it is that we're doing at the moment, which passes for strategy. I certainly agree with the point that's been made, and I think that the governor just agreed to it too, that we ought to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. If one wants to quibble about whether it's a terrorist organization, okay, call it something else, but prohibit it, because it is involved in sedition against this country, full stop. Sadly, the threats that were talked about today are metastasizing. It's not just Iran, it's not just the rest of the global jihad movement. We've got Russia on the march in a revanchist incarnation under Vladimir Putin that looks as though it wants to reestablish as much of the old Soviet empire as it can. Not necessarily under communism, strictly speaking, but some other form of fascism or totalitarianism. We're confronting Chinese imperialism. I think Peter Husey and others were talking about the extent to which we're now confronting a nuclear capability in China that is vastly larger than we're being told. Vastly larger. Just to give you an example of this, did you know that the Chinese have built what it's been called the underground Great Wall of China. It's 3,000 miles of underground hardened tunnel complexes. That's coast to coast in the United States, just to give you a sense of the scale of this thing, to secrete their nuclear missiles and heavens knows what all else from our detection, from our monitoring, and from our targeting. And I suggest to you that's the kind of commitment to an enterprise that probably has other attributes that we don't even know about, but that we should be concerned about. So Chinese imperialism in the South China Sea, for that matter, in Africa, in the Caribbean, elsewhere in our hemisphere should be of great concern. There's a North Korean nuclear buildup underway. I think we heard in the course of some of the remarks, I would think it was Peter Price, about satellites possibly being used by the North Koreans, as well as missiles to deliver, say, an EMP. Several of our speakers have talked about one of the absolutely certain upshots of this Iran deal, and that is the cascading proliferation of nuclear weapons, both in the Middle East and probably elsewhere. As people look around and say, well, if they've gotten away with it, why not us? And somebody observed the other day that if the Greeks had had nuclear weapons, do you think they would have been treated as shabbily by the European Union as they were? I mean, heaven's sakes, they're members of the European Union. Consider how badly they got the end of the stick versus what the Iranians got. And they theoretically don't even have a nuclear weapon yet. The message is not being lost on anybody, folks. Then there's Cuba. Cuba is another nation that has been at war with the United States since Fidel Castro came to power. Mostly a coldish war, but what Castro has been doing, as I think we've discussed at least briefly, is trying to build anti-American governments and revolutionary entities, terrorist groups, what have you, throughout our hemisphere. Now increasingly in league with the Iranians, with the Chinese, with the Russians, the North Koreans even. You've got Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as the FARC, that are operating, in some cases, right at our border. The Islamic State is even said to be there. This is not an accident, comrade, as they like to say in totalitarian Soviet systems like the Castro brothers, whom we are now providing life support to. You may have noticed that when the Russians collapsed, the Soviet Union went away, Venezuela stepped into the breach. Now that Venezuela is collapsing, who's stepping into the breach? We are. And anybody who tells you that there's going to be a lot of money made by American capitalists there needs to know the place is bankrupt, which means you will be paying for whatever business is done there with credit guarantees or loans or other cash flow. This is, in short, no time to be hollowing out the U.S. military. That's for sure. Whether it's cutting its force structure, whether it's imperiling its readiness, whether it's endlessly delaying its modernization, whether it's stressing to the breaking point and probably beyond the guys like Tommy Waller and the others here who've served in uniform, which we're doing because we still need them in all of these dangerous places, even though there are fewer of them to do the job, which means you get, 10-month deployments now of carrier battle groups and the like, which is just crushing, of course, for the morale of our troops. And then there's the social engineering that was spoken to very effectively, I thought, but you cannot actually appreciate probably if you're not actually in the boots that we put on the ground or in any of the other services, what this social engineering actually translates into. I mean, just think about it. What do you do with the fact that somebody who can't make up their mind about what gender they are has to use one of two sets of facilities, for example? This is in an environment, particularly if you're in, the Force Recon Marines like Tommy here, where you don't exactly have a whole lot of privacy. I mean, the only thing I can tell you, folks, is you've got to be indifferent to the well-being of the troops, let alone their fighting trim. Or more likely, you're seeking to destroy them, to wreck this incredible institution of our country, the most revered of all, and rightly so. Which goes to an argument that was going back and forth here a moment ago as to motive. I'll just conclude with this. As you have heard, the nature of this deal, this Obama bomb deal, the way it's been structured with the active involvement, some might say connivance of Republicans, is to make it exceedingly difficult to defeat it. I believe it must be fought no matter what, and fought with everything we've got, because it is literally a matter of life and death. But I would also share with you one other thought, again, hearkening back to my experience admiring before I served him and then during my time with President Reagan. Arguably, the penultimate most important national debate we've had on a treaty, and indeed the governor's right, this is a treaty, should be considered as such, and it is an affront to the Constitution, to say nothing of the checks and balances that the framers designed, that the president is simply blindly saying, no, it's not. And I'm taking it to the UN to implement rather than the Congress. Right. But I would argue that the most important previous of these accords was a treaty treated as a treaty, and a treaty that became a matter of great controversy at the time, partly thanks to Ronald Reagan. That treaty was the one that invoked the surrender of the Panama Canal back in 1978. I don't know if you remember that, but it was a very, very hot debate. Even, if you can believe this, William F. Buckley was on the wrong side of that debate, leading to a memorable back and forth with President, then citizen Reagan. But what came of that, even though in that instance, as you may remember, the Reagan view was ultimately undermined and defeated, when the Republican leader of the United States Senate joined those supporting the surrender of the Panama Canal Treaty. Does this sound familiar? Howard Baker agreed that the treaty should be approved, and it was narrowly. But what happened was, in the course of that, I keep saying President Reagan, not even candidate Reagan, Citizen Reagan, used the occasion to help teach the American people what the Carter foreign policy was all about. What were the premises? What were the flaws? What were the perils of it? And again, this preceded the 1979 debacle with the Iranians. But that was of a piece, of course, with the rest of it. But he began building the case against both that president and his policies. And I think what's so critical and relevant to our own time is this is a moment in which we can do the same. Win, lose, or draw on the Iranian Obama bomb deal. To shape, to frame, to help people across this country, and especially in places like this, to understand what's wrong with this policy approach and what needs to be done differently. Because out of that, with President candidate Reagan, came two things. One, he became President Reagan. He was elected overwhelmingly, as you remember. But as important, he received a mandate to adopt a very different national security policy. One he called peace through strength. One that involved, from day one, the rebuilding of America's military, which had been hollowed out in that period, not quite as badly as this, but in much the same spirit. And then he proceeded to adopt this strategy for defeating the Soviet Union. Remember, we win, they lose? Well, that's basically what he set about to do. And he had the support of virtually the entire country, at least in the Electoral College, to do that. So, ladies and gentlemen, because you are in that special state of being citizens of this granite state, I want to say to you that you have a special opportunity as well as a special responsibility to see if the people who wish to be our next commander-in-chief have the sort of stuff that will enable them not only to get elected on the basis of sensible national security policies, and not just that they've gone to school on it and that they're thoughtful about it, but they're committed to sensible national security policies. That's a necessary condition, don't get me wrong. Absolutely critical. But it's not sufficient. We need them also to be able to articulate and to pursue and to secure a mandate from the American people to change the sorts of things that we've just shared with you throughout this long day to a different approach. Peace through strength, if you will, 2.0 maybe, but whatever you want to call it, to get this ship of state back on a straight course that is not going to put it on the shoals, and that will provide for the security not only of this, our generation, but our children and our children's children, because, as has been pointed out earlier, as Reagan said, freedom has to be fought for by every generation because it always faces an existential threat. You have heard about those facing our generation. Again, I say to you what I said about that grid stuff. You now know more about this issue, I wager, than most people in Congress. And with this issue, I mean the whole portfolio of national defense. And so I'm hoping you're going to feel a duty as well as an ability to to spend the time in your living rooms, in your diners, in your VFW halls, in your parishes with these candidates and make sure they're up to snuff. And this is the year, folks. By next year, it's too late. First of all, you'll be done shortly after it begins. This is the year when they have to spend time here talking to you, getting to know you, you getting to know them. And while this is not a political appeal, it's just a national security-minded recommendation to do what you can to make sure that anybody who's standing for elective office, whether it's for the presidency or anything else, has something of the knowledge that you now have. Most of you came here with a lot already. I hope you've found it enhanced and enriched. But especially for those of you who've really learned something today, please take this duty to heart and act on it. And we at the Center for Security Policy, and I think I can speak for all of my colleagues, are anxious to help you. To the extent you'd like to know more, securefreedom.org is our website. John's is understandingthethreat.com. Peter Prize is, I don't remember what, emptaskforce.org. Peter Husey has got something. Do you have a website for geostrategy? Peter Husey at Pete Husey, P. Husey. Well, that's your email address. No, that's not what I'm looking for. Anyway, get in touch with us. We're happy to be in touch with you. Let me just say in closing again, especially for those of you who have stayed the course throughout the day, but also for all the rest of you who joined us earlier on and couldn't, thank you from the bottom of my heart, as I thank also all these marvelous speakers and presenters, and it is a testament, I hope, to our shared commitment to our country, which heavens knows deserves to be protected, and I hope you'll be part of doing so. Thank you very much.